You ready?
Yes, Your Honor.
Proceed.
Dr. Urquiza, what is the psychological impact of a child ultimately disclosing? Does something happen?
Sir, your mic.
Dr. Urquiza, what is the psychological consequence or impact on a child who ultimately discloses to something happening to that child given that disclosure?
Well, one of the things that children tell us immediately happens is that there's a sense of relief from disclosing, assuming that the response to that disclosure was supported. But there's a sense of relief. What there may well be is some degree of benefit on the mental health side. One of the things that happens with sexually abused children who are involved in therapy is the process in part involves talking about what happened or disclosing what's happened. And then also incorporating a lot of the feelings that occurred, as well as changing or modifying a lot of the distortions that the child may have acquired as a result of their victimization. So this process of just going through the act of disclosure starts the process that is parallel to, it's not therapy, but it is like therapy. It is maybe the first part of that. And so oftentimes, from the point of disclosure, kids have this sense of relief, and there may be some gain or improvement with regard to mental health symptoms. Especially if it is also responded to, as is often the case, to disclose, and then they usually get some type of mental health treatment. So it's followed by therapy which is specifically designed to help alleviate some mental health symptoms.
Thank you, Doctor. I have no further questions.
Mr. Mesereau.
Yes, please, Your Honor. Good morning.
Just barely morning.
Huh.
Just barely morning.
Okay. We've never spoken before, right?
I don't believe I have ever spoken with you.
My name is Tom Mesereau and I speak for Mr. Michael Jackson.
Okay.
Now, first of all, you've indicated the great majority of your expert witness testimony has been for prosecutors, for the government, correct?
That's correct.
What percentage of your expert witness testimony would you say has been for the government?
Well, actually, the clarification would be of criminal and juvenile court. So of criminal court, 4 or 5 times have testified for the defense, and then about 85 times total, so that would be, you could do the math, but that would be the portion.
So about 90%.
Roughly.
90% for the prosecution.
Correct.
In criminal court, correct?
In criminal court.
Now, when you testified in juvenile court, they were prosecutions, correct?
No.
What were they?
They were part of the juvenile court process where the issue is related to the safety and well-being of a child, through the child welfare system, is placed in foster care, and then there's an 18-month process by which there's unification. So it could be in any aspect of the child welfare system, but it doesn't include any criminal involvement, at least for the part that I do.
So you were not involved in efforts to convict juveniles of crimes?
That is correct. I have not been involved in juvenile prosecutions. Or in juvenile prosecutions through the child welfare system.
When you testified in juvenile court, who hired you?
I'm usually paid for either by the county or by the court.
Okay.
Sometimes I'm paid for by the parties, but for the most part, it's by the county or the court.
Were prosecutors involved in these juvenile proceedings?
No.
Okay. Are you being paid for your services?
Yes.
What are you being paid?
My rate's $175 an hour.
Okay. Have you been paid any amount of money to date?
No.
How much do you expect to be paid?
Well, of course, it's $175 an hour. I don't know how long my testimony will go.
Okay. How many hours have you put in so far?
Oh, about maybe 10 hours. That's just an estimate.
And?
Maybe less than that.
Okay. You had meetings or discussions with prosecutors for the government in this case, haven't you?
I've had meetings and discussion with Mr. Zonen.
Okay. Anyone else?
I've been introduced to other people, but I have really not had any substantive discussion with anybody other than Mr. Zonen.
And when were you first contacted by Mr. Zonen?
Approximately a month and a half, maybe 2 months ago.
Have you testified as an expert witness for this prosecuting office before?
I have never testified in Santa Barbara County before.
This is the first time.
This is the first time I've testified in Santa Barbara County.
Now, which district attorney's offices in California have you testified for?
I don't know that I could name all of them, but I could tell you that most of the DA's offices in Northern California, primarily in Sacramento and surrounding counties. As far south as Kings County, and Tulare County. As far north as Siskiyou County. Occasionally into the Bay Area, San Francisco, San Mateo, Alameda, Napa. Napa's not quite the Bay Area, but primarily in the Northern California, Central Valley counties. Actually, with one exception. I testified for the defense in San Diego County.
Okay, now, you're a PhD in clinical psychology, is that correct?
Correct.
You're not a medical doctor, right?
That is correct.
And you can't prescribe medication, right?
That is correct.
And you're not a psychiatrist, right?
Correct.
And would you describe your professional activities as primarily research-oriented?
No.
How would you describe the primary thrust of your professional activities?
The mission of the University of California faculty is really to do three things: to do research, to teach, and to provide clinical service. And I have done all three of those things throughout the course of my career in the UC faculty in UC. It changes periodically, sometimes from month to month or from year to year, but I've always done all three of those things.
And currently, what would the percentage breakdown of your time be as far as those three things are concerned?
Probably, this is a guess. I don't mean to be flippant about this, but the numbers may well include more than 100%, because my job often includes more than 100%. I would say about 50 to 60% currently is clinical in some capacity. I'd say about 30 to 40% is administrative. Is research related. And then probably about 30 to 40% related to teaching in some capacity.
Now, would the clinical activities you're engaged in involve counseling children?
I used to do therapy or counseling. I stopped about 3 or 4 years ago. I had done counseling starting when I entered graduate school in 1983. And then again, about 3 or so years ago I stopped, and continuously for that time. But because of the demands of my position and other responsibilities, it was just really difficult for me to make a regularly scheduled appointment every week, which I felt was a requirement if I'm going to make a commitment to doing therapy with a child. So I stopped doing therapy specifically for that reason.
So for the last 3 or 4 years, you have not spent much of your time counseling children, correct?
Yes, doing therapy. I still have clinical contact with children and families, but not in a therapeutic capacity.
Well, the clinical contact you have is primarily for academic purposes, correct?
No.
What is the primary purpose of the clinical work that you're currently doing?
2 things. One is I still am involved in evaluations, so I evaluate children and families. Again, much of that is related to the juvenile court system. And then I supervise cases and do intake assessments on a regular basis. But it's just the part about therapy that I dropped out because of the demand for the regular weekly meeting.
And how much of your current work is related to forensic?
Forensic,
like you're doing today.
Like testifying.
Yes.
Or
forensic preparation, forensic evaluation, forensic testimony.
Oh, a small percentage. Certainly less than 5%.
And please tell the jury what the word forensic means.
To my knowledge, being just something that has to do with the courtroom, criminal prosecution. Again, in my field, being the field of psychology, usually mental health, its interaction with some aspect of the court.
Now, you've published a lot of papers about various aspects of clinical psychology, correct?
Mostly related to child maltreatment.
Okay.
It may not always be related to psychology. Some of the things I do are related to child welfare services or social services, not psychology.
You would agree that false claims of sexual abuse are made by children?
Certainly.
And none of the papers you've published have ever dealt with that subject, correct?
Correct. That's not an area of research that I do.
And you've also generated a lot of papers on various aspects of your work that have not been published formally, right?
Some. I don't know that I would say a lot, but I have some manuscripts that are in preparation. Maybe 4, 5 or 6 that are included on my CV that are not currently in a journal or a book.
And none of those papers have ever dealt with the subject of false claims of sexual abuse by children, right?
That's correct. Again, it's not an area of research that I do.
There are people in your position, PhDs in clinical psychology, who do specialize in the area of false claims of sexual abuse by children, right?
I'm not sure that they specialize in it. There certainly are people who are my colleagues who have done research in the area of false allegations of sexual abuse.
And they've actually published papers on that particular subject, right?
There are several publications related to false allegations, yes.
And you're aware that in California there have been some high-profile criminal cases which involved false claims of sexual abuse by children, right?
I need more information.
Are you aware of a case in recent years that took place in Bakersfield where children testified they'd been sexually abused? There were convictions, and years later these testifying children came forward and said what they said was false.
I'm going to object as exceeding the scope of the direct examination and relevancy.
Overruled.
I'm not aware of a case like that.
You've never made any study of that particular case, right?
I'm not aware of any case like that.
Have you ever heard of a case called McMartin that took place in Los Angeles County many years ago?
I'm aware of the McMartin case.
Are you aware that false claims of sexual abuse were made in that case?
I am, although my knowledge of the McMartin case is rather small. I wasn't involved in that case, so I know very little about that case.
Okay. Have you studied, in the course of obtaining your undergraduate degree, master's or PhD, have you actually studied as a subject the area of false claims of sexual abuse by children?
Yes, and I have a quick caveat that I would add to that, but absolutely. There are probably about 7, 8, maybe 10 research studies related to false allegations. And the caveat is a part of the research that I do is specifically on methodology, about how to do research related to sexual abuse and physical abuse, primarily. And the caveat is, it's very difficult to get good information about false allegations, because what you're fundamentally researching is something that didn't happen. Clearly false allegations happen, but that issue of researching something that didn't happen is really hard. Now, of those studies, I'm certainly aware of those studies. I have read most or maybe all of those studies. But anything that I would say, and actually I would argue that anything that anybody would say related to false allegations should include that caveat, because it is just a difficult area to do research in.
But certainly there's a wealth of material you can look at if it becomes your main interest as a researcher, correct?
I wouldn't say that there's a wealth of material. There are, in fact, some studies. Now, when I say material, I'm really referring to what the research is in child sexual abuse. A lot of people have written and a lot of attorneys and certainly a lot of defense attorneys have written a lot, maybe a wealth of material about false allegations, and I have not read that. The focus of my reading has been on what research exists with regard to false allegations.
Well, in your clinical work, have you ever made it a point to interview anyone who originally testified to sexual abuse, and later came forward and said, I lied?
In my experience, there have been, that I know of, 2 cases where a false allegation was made. Now, that may seem like a rather small number, but most of, or pretty much all of the children that I see in therapy are children who have already been identified as having been abused, and then they go off to therapy so they would come and see me. I'm usually not involved in the investigation part of the process, so it's conceivable that a different number of false allegations could happen and I have not been involved in those.
Now, isn't it true that if you had been testifying for the prosecutors in any of these cases where there were false allegations, you would have testified exactly as you did here today, right?
I'm not sure I understand the question.
Let me rephrase it. Maybe I didn't phrase it properly. Let's look at these cases where false allegations of sexual abuse by children were made. Okay. If you had been called by the prosecution to testify for the prosecution in any of those cases, you would have said exactly what you said here today, right?
Do you mean with regard to the child sexual abuse accommodation syndrome?
With regard to everything you've testified to today.
There may be some minor variations, depending upon time, as we acquire more information, more research. Certainly we know more information now than we did 10 years ago. I have testified in cases 10 years ago, so there might be some minor variations. I'd argue that generally it would be the same.
And when you talked to Mr. Zonen about your testimony today, you didn't discuss the subject of false statements of sexual abuse by children, did you?
I don't recall Mr. Zonen asking me questions about false allegations.
Okay. In the clinical work that you currently do any of your colleagues do clinical work in the area of false allegations of sexual abuse by children?
I'm not aware of anybody who does clinical work. I am aware of some of my colleagues who do research with regard to false allegations, but not clinical work.
Okay.
You never know exactly what clinical work in false allegations would be comprised of.
In your courses that you teach at University of California, Davis, do you ever teach students about the subject of false allegations of sexual abuse by children?
Yes.
And have you written anything on that subject?
No.
Do you use a casebook or a coursebook that deals with that subject?
The simple answer to that question is no, but that may be a little deceptive, because I no longer teach in a classroom setting. I teach in a graduate level. So I teach in the capacity of training people to be therapists, training to be psychologists or social workers, and so there would not be something like a coursebook for the lectures or the discussions, the lectures that I have related to false allegations.
When you teach about the subject of false claims of sexual abuse by children, do you teach your students some of the reasons you believe children make false claims of sexual abuse?
Yes.
And please tell the jury what those reasons are.
Sure. Well, and it's founded on what the research is, not necessarily what my personal opinion is, because it's the research.
Sure.
Issue with the caveat.
Sure.
There are, in fact, a history of research related to false allegations that kids make. That is, false allegations being that they make an allegation that they were sexually abused, but it turns out that they were not sexually abused. And the difficulty, with the caveat, and I impress so many times, sometimes it's really difficult to determine whether somebody was abused or not. The research shows that there are a few dominant reasons why kids would make false allegations. Actually, primarily one reason why a child would make a false allegation, and that would be related to issues with a marital dissolution custody dispute, animosity between a husband and wife who are breaking up. The notion would be husband and wife break up, husband or wife are angry with the other one, so they make an allegation of sexual abuse because this issue of custody is pending. It's a problem that is extremely difficult for family court systems who actually have funded some of the research related to false allegations. I don't know if that was the primary reason why false allegations occur.
There are other reasons, too, correct?
There may well be other, that's the largest. There could be other reasons. They would tend to be more, maybe, situational or case-specific.
If you saw a situation where parents were involved in a very, very acrimonious divorce, okay. And for the first time in that relationship allegations of serious physical abuse were surfacing, and in the middle of this acrimonious divorce all of a sudden one parent goes to the authorities and says, "My soon-to-be ex-spouse has been molesting a child for years," would that cause you to pause regarding the accuracy of that allegation?
That's a tough question for me to answer. The reason being, it's not my job to make a determination about whether a particular child has been abused or not. I could argue, you phrased it that, okay, there's a late or delayed accusation about sexual abuse, and maybe the parent put the child up to it. I could similarly argue that circumstances within the family or maybe the relationship between the parent and the child had changed. Maybe the parents had separated and the child felt safer and able to disclose the sexual abuse. It's difficult to not disclose physical abuse, because if you get hit, you have red marks, you get a black eye. That's really hard to keep secret. Sexual abuse is a lot different. So I could make an argument for both sides. That, okay, I should be concerned, or that it's common for kids who have been sexually abused. I think the primary statement that I would make is it's not my place as a mental health provider to make a determination about whether a child has been abused or not, sexually abused or physically abused or in any other ways.
Excuse me, and is what you're saying that your line of work is primarily to do research in these areas as opposed to evaluate, is that correct?
Well, evaluate, almost. Evaluate in the context of mental health problems. I certainly assess and evaluate children or families all the time. But I assess and evaluate regarding whether they have a mental health problem or not whether they've been abused or not.
Okay, and would it be correct to say to the jury that, as you sit here today, you don't make a living evaluating whether or not claims of sexual abuse by children are true or not, right?
Certainly. I make a living being faculty in the Department of Pediatrics, being a psychologist, conducting research, providing mental health services, teaching. I am not involved in the determination of whether a particular child has been abused or not. And it's not my place, and I don't, actually even further argue, it is not the place of a mental health provider to make a determination about whether a particular person was abused or not, or whether a particular person is a perpetrator or not. In the criminal setting, that's the responsibility of a jury.
Now, You made a comment that parents can put their children up to lying about sexual abuse, correct?
I think I made it as a part of an example.
And you would certainly agree that parents can encourage or induce children to make false claims of sexual abuse, correct?
Particularly within that context of animosity between parents in issues of custody, which is where most of the writing with regard to false allegations comes. That has been a concern. Now, I always hate to go to absolutes, so it is possible for a child to be supported in their false allegation by their parent.
If you had a situation where you had a mother and her children, and you had evidence that the mother and her children had, from a psychological standpoint, adopted someone as a parental figure. Maybe there isn't a formal marriage. Maybe there isn't a long-term relationship, but
I'm going to object as compound, Your Honor, and the narrative of the question itself.
I haven't finished my hypothetical, Your Honor.
He's allowed to form a hypothetical. Do you want the court reporter to read to where you were?
I can rephrase it, thanks.
All right.
Let me give you a hypothetical question. You've got a mother and 3 children. There is no father figure present. There has been a traumatic divorce of recent vintage. For whatever reason, the mother and her children pick someone and adopt that person as the father figure. And they refer to that person as daddy, and they refer to that person as the father of the children, and the mother encourages the children to refer to that person in that light. And suddenly there is a split. The mother, the children sense that the person they've adopted as their surrogate father, as their father figure, is bailing out, is getting out of the situation, for whatever reason. You could imagine, couldn't you, as a professor of clinical psychology, a situation like that where the mother suddenly induces the children to make false claims of sexual abuse?
As you frame that question, I mean, there's 2 parts to my answer. As you frame that question to me, I can imagine it, because you just framed it for me.
Yes.
But that would seem to me, in my experience in the research that I know about sexual abuse and even false allegations, to be fairly incredible. The issue being, 1, as I said earlier, it's about custody. And the research, with the caveat about false allegations, is when there is a custody dispute. That is, mom doesn't want the kids to go over to dad because she's, or he's maybe sexually abused them, or vice versa, and there is this issue about who has legal right to these children. And that scenario that you just gave me doesn't seem like there would be that issue about who has legal right to it. And on top of that, the research that we're talking about, just to make sure that we're clear, the prevalence of it, is that the numbers are really pretty small. It's difficult and maybe misleading to say, okay, well, there's these large number of kids who are making false allegations. The studies show that somewhere, at least around 2 to 6% of kids who make allegations that are false or that may be false. So we're looking at a very small number of kids to begin with, and with, what I would argue, doesn't fit into that high percentage group that the research describes.
But, doctor, you know that in nasty divorces, very often one spouse will induce a child to falsely accuse another spouse. Not just to get custody, to be nasty and to hurt the person. You know that happens every day, doesn't it?
That may be your experience, but it's not supported by the research, that kids make false allegations related to being sexually victimized every day, or make a lot. I mean, those are words that you qualified with. The research does not support that.
But you just said you're not an expert in the area of false allegations of sexual abuse by children, didn't you?
No, I don't believe I said that.
You just said you don't do any research in that area, correct?
That's not an area of research that I do. I do a different area of research.
And you've never published an article about that.
Your Honor, I ask the witness be allowed to finish his answer in its entirety.
Sustained.
But of the research that exists, I have read most or all of the existing research, not just writing that somebody did, related to false allegations.
You don't know anything about the recent Bakersfield case, correct?
I'll object. Assuming facts not in evidence that there is a recent Bakersfield case.
I'll allow you to answer.
Yeah, I'm not aware of a case in Bakersfield.
You're not aware of a case where false allegations of child molestation were made, people were convicted, were incarcerated.
Objection. Asked and answered.
You never heard of it.
Sustained. Just a minute. I want to stop for just a second. Just because the legal term, hypothetical question, has just arisen in this case. And at the end of the case, I'm going to instruct you on the law concerning the whole entire case, but occasionally because of things that happen during the trial. I'm going to give you instruction to help you deal with the evidence. And that's the case here. So if you would please listen to this instruction. CALJIC 2.82. In examining an expert witness, counsel may ask a hypothetical question. This is a question in which the witness is asked to assume the truth of a set of facts and to give an opinion based on that assumption. In permitting this type of question, the court does not rule and does not necessarily find that all of the assumed facts have been proved. It only determines that those assumed facts are within the possible range of the evidence. It is for you to decide, from all the evidence, whether or not the facts assumed in a hypothetical question have been proved. If you should decide that any assumption in the question has not been proved, you are to determine the effect of that failure of proof on the value and weight of the expert opinion based on the assumed facts. Thank you, counsel. Sorry for the interruption.
Thank you, Your Honor. I want to add a few facts to the hypothetical I gave you. Okay. Let's assume, hypothetically, the mother and son have been involved in prior litigation where the son, at an early age, testified under oath in support of the mother. Let's assume that lawyers were retained. The mother and son had experience with lawyers, have experience making allegation of sexual assault and obtaining money in the process. Let's assume the facts I just told you, about the mother, the son, and siblings, for whatever reason, adopting a new father figure to the point where they're referring to that person as daddy, and referring to that person to various people as someone who takes care of them, who has adopted their family and become the father figure. Let's assume that the new so-called daddy decides he doesn't want to be around these people. Something doesn't seem right, and let's assume there is a falling apart. Let's also assume the mother and son again go to lawyers. Not the police lawyers. And let's assume that they are interested again in financial gain. Given what I've given you in that hypothetical, you can certainly envision the possibility of false claims of sexual abuse, correct?
The difficulty that I have with your hypothetical,
Yes.
is that I perceive my responsibility here is to provide information about what the research has to say about child sexual abuse. And while your hypothetical, your story, is clear, I know of no research that goes to that point. So I don't think I can answer your question.
Well, you're not telling the jury that there has been no research on false claims of sexual abuse for purposes of manipulating the legal system and obtaining financial gain, are you?
My understanding of the research with regard to false allegations, I don't recall a single article where the goal of the research literature, where the goal was making a false allegation for financial gain. Now, perhaps making a false allegation to retain custody of your child, as I mentioned earlier, but I'm not aware of any research related to false allegations for financial gain.
But you're certainly not suggesting to the jury that false allegations of sexual abuse cannot be made for purposes of financial gain, are you?
I'm not making that statement. I'm just
Okay.
trying to describe what the research says.
Have you had a lot of experience with allegations of sexual abuse appearing in civil cases as opposed to criminal cases?
A couple, but not very many, maybe two.
Do you know whether or not, if somebody is criminally prosecuted and convicted of molestation, whether or not the alleged victim would automatically win a civil case if they filed one?
I'll object as lack of foundation.
Sustained.
Now, you've indicated that you're aware of false claims by children of sexual abuse, right?
Me specifically, or with regard to the research?
The research.
Okay, yes.
And you're aware that adults can encourage children to make false claims of sexual abuse, correct?
Certainly they can encourage, and again, usually that's within the context of marital dissolution and custody.
I know your point, but that's through the articles and research you've read. You aren't saying it can't happen in other contexts, are you?
I'm not saying that.
And you're certainly not saying that parents could not encourage children to make false claims of sexual abuse for financial reasons, are you?
I'm not making that statement.
Okay, now, you'd agree that children will sometimes exaggerate claims that they've been abused, true?
I'm not sure what you mean by exaggerate. I know the casual term of exaggerating, but you seem to have a more specific one related to sexual abuse.
Well, I mean, you know what the word exaggeration means, right?
That's what I mean, in sort of casual terms. But I guess I'm asking if you could be more specific with regards to sexual abuse.
Well, certainly you would agree that children can be touched by someone, and at some point in time exaggerate that touching to be something along the lines of molestation or inappropriate touching when it isn't.
Certainly that would be possible.
So what you're saying is there are possibilities of pure falsehood. In other words, a child says sexual abuse happened when they aren't even touched. And there are possibilities of exaggeration, where a child is touched, but not inappropriately, and then the child comes forward and says, I was touched inappropriately, correct?
Those are two possibilities.
Yes.
I don't think I've ever encountered the second possibility, but certainly it's possible.
Well, common sense would tell you that it's certainly possible that a child could be touched appropriately, and at some point come forward and say that touching was either, I was molested, or, I was touched in an inappropriate way. That makes sense that could happen, doesn't it?
It's possible, yes.
Okay, but in your studies, you've never come across it. Is that what I'm hearing?
That description.
Yes.
About the pattern of exaggerating.
Yes.
Is not pronounced in the literature related to false allegations.
It's not pronounced in the literature, but you're not saying it doesn't happen.
I'm not saying it doesn't happen. It's possible.
Let's be honest. If parents are touching their children, and they suddenly go through a nasty divorce, and all of a sudden claims of inappropriate touching happens, they may be exaggerated, right?
It's possible that could happen.
And would you agree that in the last, say, 15 years, you've seen a tremendous increase in claims of molestation in divorce cases?
I don't know the literature on that. I don't know that I could answer that question.
Okay. Do you routinely in your work look for research articles on the subject of false claims?
Yes.
By children?
False allegations, yes.
Okay. And are studies in this area being done at your university as we speak?
On false allegations?
Yes.
No. To my knowledge, and the issue of sexual abuse, and the clinical aspects of sexual abuse, they are being done at my agency, because that's what we do within the Department of Pediatrics. There is another researcher in the Department of Psychology who does developmental research that is related to physical and sexual abuse, but not to the clinical aspects of sexual abuse.
Okay. Now, let me ask you some questions about the way children might react if they truly have been sexually abused. Okay. Now, the prosecutor asked you some questions about a child becoming aggressive because a child has been sexually abused, right?
Yes, I believe he did.
And if you have a situation where a child has been aggressive, say, in school before any allegation of sexual abuse arises, you wouldn't look at that child and say, I see evidence of sexual abuse because the child's being aggressive, would you?
It is difficult to say if any particular symptom, in this case you're using aggressiveness, is directly related to physical abuse or sexual abuse. You can be aggressive for a lot of different types of reasons. It is hard to say, okay, you're aggressive. You've been sexually abused. I would not go there.
And it would complicate your ability to attribute aggressiveness to sexual abuse if you knew that particular child was acting aggressively in school before the alleged abuse, right?
It may complicate it. The issue, as I said earlier, is, aggression may well be a reflection of the distress that a victim has, but it could also be something related to another aspect of their life unrelated to being victimized.
For example, if a child had been a chronic discipline problem in school, a child had been constantly called to the carpet for fighting, getting up in the middle of class and singing, disrupting teachers, calling teachers names, being bounced out of every class, ordered to detention and not showing up to detention. If you had factors like that, that would complicate your ability to say that aggressiveness was a function of sexual abuse at a later date, right?
Well, I would actually say it the other way around. I would say that sometimes kids who are sexually abused exhibit those kinds of problems. I would be reluctant to say that because you exhibit those kinds of problems, that you therefore have been sexually abused.
Right. Okay. Wouldn't you agree that children who actually have been sexually abused tend to react to that abuse in different ways?
Certainly.
Some children who have been sexually abused appear severely traumatized, right?
Yes, but that's actually a minority of kids who are severely traumatized by sexual abuse. It is something that some kids go through, but it's not a frequent occurrence.
Well, some kids would seem to take it in stride better than other kids, right?
That's correct.
Some seem to be very traumatized by it, and some can show remarkable abilities to take it in stride, correct?
We call it resilience.
Yes. Some children who have been actually sexually abused will tend to act out their sexual abuse, correct?
Act out, meaning, I have a sense of what act out usually is, but I'm not sure if it's exactly what you mean.
They will, in a very overt, dramatic way, describe it, right?
Now, are you talking about the disclosures, or are you talking about the symptom presentation?
I'm talking about both. Some children. I'm not saying all. Some children who actually have been sexually abused will describe what happened to them in a very dramatic descriptive fashion, right?
That's possible, yes.
And some, on the other hand, who have been sexually abused will become very withdrawn, right?
Correct. That's possible.
Some children who have been sexually abused will immediately tell someone about it, true?
That is, in fact, possible. Certainly that occurs, as I testified earlier. It occurs in a small minority of cases, but certainly it is possible, and I would guess that it does occur.
And some will never tell anybody about it at all, right?
Yes. I didn't add that to what Mr. Zonen had asked me. I know I said that there are some people who don't disclose their sexual abuse until they're adults. Now, it's my opinion that there are some people who don't disclose throughout their entire lifetime, but I don't have any research, obviously, to be able to point to that.
And again, everything you're saying comes out of research studies that you've looked at, right?
Either that I've looked at or that I've done.
You're not giving opinions to the jury based upon any of the therapeutic work you've done with actual children, true?
There may have been a couple of times where was asked my opinion about an issue, and I've tried to frame it with the statement, in my opinion, rather than that's what the research says. And I think I just did that a minute ago with regard to people who don't disclose throughout their entire lifetime.
Okay, but what I'm trying to get at is this. You're giving the jury opinions about the subject. You've said some children act out their abuse and some become very withdrawn. Some become traumatized and others take it in stride, right?
Well, actually, I think it's.
What are your opinions based on?
I think it's actually different than that. My job is to provide information about what the research has to say.
Right.
Not to sit here and just provide an opinion about what I've seen as a clinician or what I think as a person. To provide what the research has to say. In those situations where I, in fact, have an opinion that's not supported by research, I have tried to say, as I gave you an example a minute ago, in my opinion, related to something. Now, the other part of your question, it's my job to educate the jury and, consistent with what Dr. Summit wrote with regard to the child sexual abuse accommodation syndrome, is to dispel myths and misperceptions about sexual abuse. And so within the context of the child sexual abuse accommodation syndrome, I do exactly the same thing that he wanted to do with therapists, but with a jury. That they have a difficult decision to make, and they should do that based upon what research has to say, and that's what I have tried to present. For example, if they have the misperception that children are sexually abused by strangers, that some guy will jump out of the bushes and molest children, that's the way it mostly happens, well, that's a misperception. It doesn't usually happen, and I think I've characterized that most children are sexually abused by someone with whom they have an ongoing relationship.
But you're not telling the jury that strangers do not molest children, are you?
No, but I am telling them that this is a misperception that strangers are the people we need to look out for with regard to the frequency of perpetrators. Most children are sexually abused by someone with whom they have an ongoing relationship. It could be a stranger, but it is infrequent for them to be sexually abused by a stranger.
Have you ever made a study of how many cases go through the criminal courts in California where children are molested by strangers who are pedophiles? Ever made a study of that?
No, but there are a number of studies that have examined the relationship between the perpetrator and the victim, and the number of strangers who molest kids are in single digits. There's different studies, depending on methodology, but it's around the 4 to 6 to 7% of children who are sexually abused by a stranger.
But do you know how many of those cases were prosecuted in California last year?
No, couldn't tell you that.
Do you know how many were prosecuted in the last 5 years?
Again, I don't do research in issues of the court and criminal prosecutions.
What you're telling the jury is that the vast majority of these cases, looking at it from a research standpoint, are done by, or involve allegations that someone the child is familiar with did this. Is that right?
That most children are sexually abused by somebody.
Yes.
with whom they have an ongoing relationship.
Yes.
Correct.
Okay. Now, you'd agree that some children who have actually been abused have very accurate memories of their being abused, right?
I would agree with that. Some children probably do.
And some children have false memories of being abused, correct?
I have a hard time with that question. If you...
Let me just ask it again.
Well, if you have not been abused, then you don't have a memory of it.
You could have a false memory of it, true.
There is literature which I consider unusual, where certain people have stated that they have a memory of being abused, and it's a false memory, it turns out. Even more so with the caveat that I have about false allegations, that I would have a significant caveat about the credibility of research related to false allegations. I forget what the phrase that they call it, but allegations that the victim appears to believe that they were abused and they were not. I mean, that is a very unusual aspect of this field.
But it certainly has happened, hasn't it?
There are reports that it's happened, yes.
And there are people in your field who are devoting a large percentage of their professional endeavors to studying that particular area, aren't they?
I'm not aware of those people.
Well, you're aware of an area dealing with what is called autosuggestion, where children are actually induced by parents, adults, and other influences to conjure up false memories of abuse. You know that's going on today.
I'm not familiar with that.
Don't know anything about that field.
No.
Okay, getting back to the issue of children who actually have been sexually abused. Okay. I'm excluding false claims. Alright, some children who actually have been abused will actually show common symptoms of abuse, correct?
There are some, well, common symptoms of distress.
Yes.
It is difficult to have common symptoms of abuse because of the diversity of symptom presentation with kids who have been sexually abused, so it's common symptoms of distress.
Well, in your response to the prosecutor's questions, you were identifying certain general ways that actual abuse victims might behave, true?
Yes, I think what I had said is, as a stereotype, it's consistent with the stereotype that female victims, who usually are victims who experience some distress resulting from their victimization, tend to be internalizing, and then males externalizing, and try to characterize or define what those two things are as broad types of expression of symptoms that victims go through.
The point I'm making is this. Some children who have actually been sexually abused will act perfectly normal, true?
Again, it's hard for me to go to the issue of absolutes, but certainly there are some kids who act normal and have no apparent external change of behavior that would give you rise to believe that they've been sexually abused.
And some children who have actually been sexually abused will not act normal, right?
Some kids who have been sexually abused typically have some type of symptom pattern that they present.
And it becomes very difficult when you observe how a child behaves to determine if that child really has been truly sexually abused, true?
It's hard to look at a child and say, okay, you've been sexually abused. That would be a difficult thing to do that.
Okay, nobody can determine with absolute accuracy that a child has been abused because they act in a certain way, right?
Again, that would be pretty much the same question that you just asked me a minute ago. It's difficult to look at the child and say, you can do it either way. To look at that child and say, okay, you've been sexually abused, and or to look at a child and say, okay, you have not been sexually abused. It's difficult to have that external ability.
Okay, now, you'd agree that in your field it almost goes without saying that parents can have a tremendous effect on whether or not their children tell the truth, right?
Yes, it should be. Actually, part of my field is also child development. And I would hope that parents have an ability to influence the lives of their children in lots of ways, one of which would include telling the truth.
And if a child is continually exposed to parents who are perpetual liars, that can have an effect to a child's view of whether lying is acceptable, correct?
I would tend to agree with that, yes. I mean, they're not all cases, but I would tend to agree with the sense that a child may have a value about lying that might be similar to that of their past.
Let me get to the subject of when an actual child victim of sexual abuse tends to disclose what happened to them. Okay. Because you talked about when they might or might not disclose it. Okay.
Okay.
And I'm going to limit my questions to situations where the literature you've studied deals with children who have actually been abused. Okay.
Okay.
I'm not talking about children who lie. I'm talking about the actual, what appear to be victims of real sexual abuse. Okay.
Okay.
You'd agree that some children will disclose it right away, won't they?
Again, a minority, and perhaps a small minority of children will make immediate disclosures.
But some do for sure, right?
It is, some children do. It is much more common for kids to have a delayed disclosure.
But you aren't telling the jury that there aren't situations where children who have been abused have not run to their parents screaming and yelling, "This person just touched me," right?
No, I think what I'm trying to do is to characterize what the research says about all disclosures, and so that means accurately portraying what the frequency of an immediate disclosure would be, and it is a small percentage of kids who do an immediate disclosure. It certainly happens.
Okay.
It is much more common for there to be either an extended delay, or a delay going into adulthood. That is, I think, an accurate characterization of this issue of frequency of disclosure.
And you're dealing with generalities that come from the research and study that you've done or reviewed, correct?
Generalities I have a difficulty with. I'm reflecting or describing what several studies have reported that are fairly consistent.
Okay.
About the issue of delayed disclosure.
But certainly you're not suggesting to the jury that every day of the year children don't run to their teachers and say, "So-and-so just touched me, so-and-so just grabbed me, you know what so-and-so just did to me." That happens all the time, doesn't it?
I'm having difficulty. Are you saying that, they touched you, they're making? So are you suggesting that it happens all the time that children make false allegations?
It happens quite often, doesn't it?
I would agree with that.
You don't think teachers get reports like that often in school?
I don't think that there are often or all the time characterizations of false allegations of sexual abuse.
Have you interviewed teachers on that subject?
There actually are.
Please answer my question.
No.
Have you personally interviewed teachers on that subject, ever?
No.
Have you done any research on that subject yourself?
I have read research, but I have not specifically done research on that subject.
Okay, now, I just want to ask you if the statements I'm making are correct or not. Okay, some children tell right away, right?
Again, I don't mean to be long-winded or redundant here.
I'm just asking you to answer my question. Is it true that some children?
Your Honor, I'd ask that the witness be allowed to answer the question without interruption of counsel.
I'll rephrase it, Your Honor.
All right.
Let me ask you to just give a response whether you think this is true or not, okay? And then if you want to explain it when the prosecutor gets up to get explanations, you can do that. True or false? Some children will disclose sexual abuse right away.
Objection. Asked and answered.
Overruled. You may answer.
That would be true.
Some children will never disclose sexual abuse, right?
That is true.
Some children will tell a little bit at one point and then tell more at a later day, true?
I would agree with that, yes.
And some children will just make up stories of abuse, right?
It is true that there are false allegations that occur.
You made some statements about details when a child makes a revelation about sexual abuse, correct?
I did talk about the disclosure and the process of disclosure, yes.
You talked about details sometimes changing when a child repeatedly discloses what has happened, allegedly, to the child, true?
I talked about, and I think what I tried to characterize was that there was a process to the disclosure, and some of the barriers that make it difficult for a child to disclose in the way in which kids would disclose being sexually abused.
But changing stories about the details of alleged sexual abuse can also be consistent with lies, true?
Lies with regard to
sexual abuse.
Again, I would agree that that's possible.
In other words, if you see details being added each time a child tells a story about alleged sexual abuse, that might be an indication, as you said, that the child was abused, or it might be an indication that the child is a flat-out liar, right?
Well, and I think that's why Dr. Summit included it in the Child Sex Abuse Accommodation Syndrome, because the presentation was, back in 1983, that just because a child wasn't completely perfect, then their disclosure was unconvincing or they weren't telling the truth. What we have since learned from research since 1983 was that the pattern that is common for kids who have been sexually abused sometimes included mistakes, or errors, or they may goof up on some of the details. And so I'm not making a statement that, okay, you made a mistake, and so, with regard to the disclosure, and so you were or are not sexually abused. I'm trying to dispel the misperception that a juror may have related to the way in which a child discloses sexual abuse. Just because they make a mistake doesn't mean it's unconvincing or doesn't mean that they weren't abused.
And just because they add new details, new stories, new dates, new versions, doesn't mean they're not liars either, does it?
Right. It could go either way.
Okay. Now, are the studies that you have looked at been studies that are, for lack of a better word, scientifically based?
They are research-based that are published in peer-reviewed journals.
How does what you've been reviewing in your work relate to science, if you can even answer that question?
I would argue that scientific research in psychology is a component of science, part of the social sciences. And then within the part of that related to children or child sexual abuse, that we engage scientific methodology to attempt, to the best of our ability, to identify what is best known about this event of sexual abuse or sexually inappropriate behavior between an adult and a child. So we try to gain knowledge related to sexual abuse.
But there certainly is no scientific way to determine if a child has truly been sexually abused or if a child is lying about it, right?
I'm not aware of any science strategy or methodology to determine guilt or innocence between a specific perpetrator and a specific victim.
Okay. And I think what you're telling the jury is nobody can determine that a child has been abused just based on what the child says, right?
No, actually, I think somewhat differently. I think what I'm trying to tell the jury is that there's a difference between what you may have grown up and learned about sexual abuse through reading magazines or watching television or talking to your friends and what research says about sexual abuse. And my job is to provide you with.
Could I ask the witness be admonished to answer the question?
I think he is answering it. You asked him if he said one thing, and he said no, he said another.
Okay.
My job is to provide information about what the research has to say about sexual abuse, and then consistent with Dr. Summit's sexual abuse accommodation syndrome, to dispel any misperceptions or myths that you have about child sexual abuse so you have perhaps a more solid foundation on which to make a determination in this specific case.
I may not have asked the question properly. It could have been my mistake. Let me ask it again. Nobody can determine that a child has been abused just based on what the child says, right?
I don't think I've ever been asked that question before. I don't know how to answer that. I mean, I could only say that that would be a difficult thing to do.
Okay.
But I don't know how to answer that question.
There's no test you can give a child to determine whether or not that child has been actually sexually abused, is there?
I'm not aware of a test to determine whether a particular perpetrator sexually abused a particular victim.
Okay. In terms of reliability of studies, okay. Do you have any thoughts on how the research studies you look at would relate to the opinions of actual clinical or therapeutic workers in this field? In other words, do you believe that the research work you do, where you review the studies that are being published, do you believe this work is more reliable than the opinions of people actually counseling children or administering therapy to children?
I earlier made a statement that it's better to rely upon what the research has to say than in my particular opinion. And I happen to be a person who believes in research and believes in science, and it's part of what I do every day. And the best example I can give you is I've seen a lot of children who have been sexually abused. But the research is founded on much more rigorous, focused and a larger number of kids than I have seen. So somebody who is in, let's say, private practice doing therapy maybe, over the course of a few years, will have seen 20, 30, 50 children who have been abused, and they take their knowledge from the children that they see. And maybe that is an accurate reflection of the research, maybe it's not. But they enhance their knowledge by reading the literature, reading scientific journals, reading professional journals about sexual abuse, and then add that to this issue of the clients that come in and the patterns they see in their clients.
But when you look at these research studies, and you tell the jury, based upon the research studies I have reviewed in my professional work, I'll give you these percentages, the reality is, you haven't talked to a single one of those alleged victims of sexual abuse that are the subject of the studies, right?
Well, with the exception of my studies, the research that I have done, if you exclude those, because, in fact, I have cited research of my own, that is true. A colleague of mine does research in Central Michigan. I have not gone to Central Michigan to talk with the subjects in her studies.
And when you read one of these studies and they say a certain percentage of victims of sexual abuse don't tell right away and a certain percentage do, the reality is, you don't even know who the people they're talking about are, right?
Well, other than a general description that they provide in a journal article or a piece of research that they do. I don't know the names of them, and I shouldn't know the names of them because their involvement in research is protected by confidentiality.
Now, based on what you told the jury in response to the prosecutor's questions, I'd like to ask you a few questions and ask if they're true. Claiming you're abused would be consistent with actual abuse, correct?
I'm not sure I understand your question.
Well, if somebody says, I have been abused, that would certainly be consistent with someone who actually has been abused, right?
I would disagree with that.
You're trying to say that victims of sexual abuse never come forward and say, I've been abused.
You can be sexually abused and say, okay, I have been abused. And you can be sexually abused, and again, as you pointed out, have a false allegation.
Well, let's put it this way. Denying you've been abused could be consistent with having actually been abused, right?
You're getting me all messed up.
Let me rephrase it. Some people say, I've been abused, and they have been. Some people deny they've been abused, and they have been. Is that what you're saying?
Correct.
By the same token, some people say they've been abused, and they haven't been at all, true?
That's correct. That happens.
And some people who deny they've been abused never were abused, right?
That would be correct, yes.
Okay, alright. You said something about allegations of sexual abuse changing. Okay. During the course of an alleged victim telling various people about what happened, right?
I made mention of that with regard to the fourth aspect of the accommodation syndrome, the unconvincing disclosure, yes.
If a child abuse, let me rephrase that. If a child is claiming they've been abused, and you notice, during a series of interviews, the dates of the alleged abuse start to change, okay.
Okay.
That could be perfectly consistent with a child who's lying, right?
That's possible.
If you knew that an alleged child victim had experience in the legal system making claims and getting money from those claims, would that cause you any pause with respect to whether or not the child was telling the truth?
I don't think that's my area to answer.
How come?
Well, what I said earlier. I mean, if you're framing it within the context of false allegations, kids, in fact, do make false allegations. And when they make false allegations, the reasons that I provided earlier were in the context of divorce and issues of custody. I wasn't aware of, or I am not aware of an instance where a child has made a false allegation specifically for the purpose of financial gain. It's possible, which is the question you just asked me, but I'm not aware of that. Nor am I aware of any research that's focused on the issue of financial gain and false allegations.
Well, you've done some therapeutic work, you said, earlier in your career, right?
Up until about 3-4 years ago, yes.
And I have to assume, as a human being, when you've interviewed people, you must have been saying to yourself from time to time, I wonder if I'm being told the truth, right?
Occasionally, but not frequently. Most of the time when I get kids for therapy, they've gone through this process where there has already been a determination about whether they've been abused or not. And it's not my place to make a determination whether they're abused or not. The focus of my attention is on decreasing mental health symptoms.
Let me ask you this, doctor. Let's assume you're doing what you just described. Based upon what you know, someone, or maybe more than one person, has made a determination that somebody has been actually abused. Okay.
Okay.
And they come to you in this therapeutic context, right?
Okay.
And you start administering therapy to this alleged victim, right?
Yes. Okay.
And in the course of your counseling this alleged victim, it suddenly dawns on you, I don't believe this person. What do?
I don't know that I've been in that situation before.
What do you do if it happens?
Probably try to address the related mental health issue if it's related to this perception that I have that it's a false allegation. Because my job is not to investigate if there would have been a determination. My job is if the child comes in and they're depressed, are they anxious, are they aggressive, is to address the mental health problem, not to investigate whether they've been abused or not. So if I have that thought or idea or feeling, then my first inclination, I think, would be to relate it to the mental health system, which is, in fact, my responsibility.
Well, your profession has certain ethical requirements you're supposed to follow, correct?
Yes.
And as you've said earlier, you're aware of situations where people have come forward years later and said, that allegation I made as a child was false, correct?
And again, are you talking about within the clients that I have seen, or just generally?
Generally.
I'm aware that there are false allegations.
Okay.
Yes.
My question to you is, as a professional, bound by certain ethical rules, if someone comes to you for therapy, and it's your understanding that some other individuals, whom you may not even know, have made a threshold determination, we think this child was abused. Okay.
Can I interrupt you in the middle of your question? In your prior question, when you said, other individuals, you pointed to these people, indicating.
No, I didn't mean they had done it. No.
And I made the determination there was an adjudication and the client was found, was identified as being victimized by a jury, because you went like that, indicating.
No, I was not.
My mistake, then.
The jury has nothing to do with this issue at the moment.
Okay.
What I'm asking you is, as a professional, someone comes to your office for therapy. It is your understanding that certain people in the system out there, whom you may not even know, made a threshold determination that they believed this person was the victim of abuse. You start your counseling sessions. You start talking to the person very intimately about what happened. You ask them about their background. You ask them about parental influence. You ask them how they live their life. You probe into who they are. And at some point a light goes off. I don't believe this person. Something's wrong. From an ethical standpoint, what do you do, as a clinical psychologist?
It's an interesting problem, and only because I don't think I've ever encountered a situation like that, and because it really runs up against this issue of confidentiality. What goes on in a therapeutic office is confidential. Clearly, there are mandates to report if you reasonably suspect somebody is abused. But you're asking me the opposite. And so, since I've never encountered a situation like that, the first thing I do is go read the either state ethics regulations or the ethics related to the American Psychological Association, because I've never encountered something like that. But it would be significant for me to break a client confidentiality, since it's one of the hallmarks of psychotherapy, so I'm not exactly sure what I would do in that situation.
Have you ever made a study of false claims of sexual abuse directed at celebrities?
I've never done a study like that, no.
Have you ever read a study about that?
I have not.
Have you done any research in the area of false lawsuits being filed against celebrities?
That's not my area of research.
Okay, now, you made some comments about the percentage of actual abusers being in a relationship of familiarity with the person abused, right?
Yes, I think I used the word acquaintance.
Okay, and I believe you said that you thought that, certainly the high percentage of abusers in situations where there's actual abuse have a familial relationship with the victim, right?
And acquaintance, relationship was the word that I used, yes.
And when you say acquaintance, what do you mean?
Somebody who has some ongoing relationship, who the child knows. It could be lots of different people. It can be a father, brother, uncle, guy who lives across the street, babysitter. You know, it can be lots of different types of people. But it's somebody who is known to the victim and typically has an ongoing relationship with them.
When you say ongoing relationship, what do you mean?
At least once, twice, 3 times. I mean, I think if the perpetrator's the guy who lives across the street, that would suggest somebody who is seen by the victim on a regular basis. If the perpetrator is somebody who lives in the house or is the babysitter, I mean, seen multiple incidents or have multiple times of interaction.
And correct me if I'm wrong on this, but it's sort of assumed that the alleged perpetrator who has an ongoing relationship with the alleged victim wants a relationship with that alleged victim, true?
I mean, I'm pondering this issue of alleged. If you get rid of that,
I won't.
That's where I get a little hung up on your question. Let's just go hypothetical, alright?
Wait, let's just take a break.
Okay, alright, okay.